Alright, we are back with a new video, and now that Big Brother 24 is wrapped up, it is time for me to give my personal thoughts on the season, and honestly, I did walk away kind of liking the season. Now granted, there are plenty of negatives that we'll get into over the course of this review, as well as certain unlikable figures that took up quite a bit of screen time, but on the whole, I did find this to be an improvement over the last couple seasons of BBUS, and a lot of that really comes from the gameplay. There was some really interesting stuff happening from week to week that really elevates the season in my eyes, and plus some pretty interesting storylines that sort of counteract some of the negativity that the season came off. But as usual, I like to break my reviews down into several sections, one talking about the cast, another talking about production slash editing decisions, as well as the gameplay of the season. And let's not waste any more time, let's get right into the video here. So starting off, I want to talk a bit about the cast from the season, and honestly, I did find it to be a step down from the last couple seasons, where I felt like BB23 had a pretty solid cast for the most part, a pretty likable cast if you ask me. And then obviously BB22 was an all-star season, so obviously you get some pretty strong people there. But this season was definitely underwhelming in terms of the actual people here. I remember at the time the cast came out that none of these people really stood out to me, and I felt like over the course of the season, none of them really popped out as all-time great characters here. Now, granted, there are some pretty notable figures here. I mean, obviously, you have the winner in Taylor, who comes out of this being pretty likable. She was a pretty fun underdog for a lot of the season, and just seeing her story going from almost being the first boot to eventually winning the season is pretty satisfying on its own. You have Monty here, who definitely was a complex figure, who got a bit overconfident and ultimately made the wrong decision at the end, leading to a pretty interesting downfall for him, where he obviously was one of the people mistreating Taylor early on in the season. And yes, while he definitely got closer with her over the course of the season, the fact that he ends up losing here after taking Taylor to the end, thinking he would beat her, is a pretty fun storyline for him. You also have Turner, who ended up being one of the bigger surprises for me, where obviously he had some not great stuff coming out of him in the preseason between the allegations his sister gave against him, as well as obviously the fact that he used to work for Mr. Beast, and that didn't go super well, which definitely soured a lot of people against him. But he actually ended up being a pretty fun presence on the season, where despite him not being that great of a player, he obviously had plenty of fun moments, like the whole muffin situation with Jasmine, and he had a bunch of really fun, relatable moments as well. Also, his vocabulary. And he ended up being one of the bigger surprises because of that. He actually ended up being one of the more likable presences here, despite him not being the best player in the world. You also have Brittany, who largely turned out how I expected her to be, although she did have a pretty interesting arc as well, particularly once you realize that she was probably not going to win the game, to where she started to play a bit more aggressively, really trying to get Michael to win. And then after Michael went out, really tried to flip the game against certain people to try to get herself to second place, only for that to come out short. So there's that. You also have Alyssa, who definitely was a bit more boring, in my personal opinion, but was obviously someone who was a bit of a passive player at points and one who never really had too much control in the game. And I did find it interesting how, at least on the show, it did present Alyssa as the one who was trying to focus more on the game, while Kyle was the one who was trying to come on to her, when in reality it was the other way around, and she was the one trying to get a showmance with Kyle, only for Kyle to eventually capitulate to that. So I did find that aspect interesting, but on the whole, she doesn't really stand out to me. You also have Michael, who was a very big character on the show, and I did kind of find myself rooting for him towards the tail end of his run, particularly once he started racking up the comp wins, to the point where I was kind of hoping he would break the comp record. And while he did come up short, I still found his run here to be pretty amusing, and also just the different ways in which he was a super fan and did various stuff like holding the door open as he was entering the house to avoid the first in the door curse. So stuff like that was pretty amusing, and Michael was definitely a standout here. Terrence was kind of boring, if I am being perfectly honest, and really I didn't really expect much from him, but still, he was just kind of there. Then you have Kyle, who is obviously a very complex figure as well, and definitely a major force for a lot of the season here, where he was obviously a pretty big player and creating the leftovers for a lot of it, but then eventually had a pretty epic downfall with all the stuff with the cookout coming out. And yes, while it's a pretty negative situation to be involved in, it still was pretty interesting seeing him coming in, largely as this naive person who definitely lacked a lot of life experience, and just seeing that playing out with his treatment of people like Alyssa, for example, and then obviously his view of the cookout, which eventually led to his downfall. Despite him being one of the more dominant players in the season, it's those things that contributed to his downfall, which I did find pretty interesting, even if it wasn't the most pleasant thing to watch. Then you have Joseph, who was definitely pretty interesting for the most part as well. Now, admittedly, he was kind of boring early on, but then we had the whole birthday thing in week 3, in which he started to be more active. And I'm actually pretty disappointed that wasn't highlighted more on the show, like Joseph 24 evolving into Joseph 25. But definitely from that point on, he definitely became a more interesting person. But even so, I wouldn't consider him an all time great character per se. Then you have Jasmine, who again was kind of there for the most part. I actually did kind of find her kind of annoying for a lot of it, but she still had a couple moments here or there, like her coining the phrase blindside butterbeans, but also like her like using the scooter after she injured her ankle for way longer than she needed to. And then of course there's her getting mad at Turner for stealing her muffins, so at least there's that, but for the most part didn't really bring too much to the table. Then you have Indy, who again was kind of there for the most part, didn't really bring much to the show, and she didn't really bring much gameplay wise either, so she was just kind of there. And then we get to the pre-mergers, which was a pretty interesting group for the most part. I mean, you have Daniel and Nicole, who I am lumping together here, but they were pretty fun villains during the pre-jury stage of the game. And while they weren't the net best players in the world and made some pretty actively bad decisions, it was pretty fun seeing their downfall here, just guiding them through them trying to target Taylor later on, only for that to contribute to them being sent out the door. Then you have Amira, who admittedly wasn't the best character in the world, but it was interesting seeing her arc in the season, her being this pretty massive player early on, but eventually having this big downfall in what was an all-time great week here. So at least there was that. Then you have Pooch, who again was largely how I expected him to be, sort of this big player early on that people didn't really trust. And then he obviously has a pretty iconic moment of volunteering himself for the block and then being sent out the door that way. And then him after the season trying to claim that, oh, live feeds don't reveal everything, which I did find pretty funny as well. But again, I wouldn't consider him to be that great of a character. And then we have the first boot of the season in Paloma, who obviously, in hindsight, Paloma definitely had some issues with mental health that kind of explained a lot of her erratic behavior over the course of the first week, but it's still pretty crazy just how big of an influence she had in the gameplay over the first week or so. And some of the stuff that she said was pretty out there, if you ask me. But obviously, I understand why she left the game, but it's still pretty crazy to think of the impact that she had on the season. So, on the whole, I did find this cast to be somewhat interesting. And while it's not the worst cast in the world, I don't really feel like there's a truly standout character here outside of Taylor and Michael, I guess. But on the whole, this cast was definitely underwhelming and definitely one of the weaker parts of the season. Now moving on to production and twists, and I feel like for the most part, this is definitely the weakest part of the season and definitely one that generated the most controversy. I agree with a lot of people here in saying that we got a whole bunch of twists here, and a lot of them ended up being pretty bad. Obviously, you had the backstage twist in week 1, where they really tried to keep it under wraps for whatever reason over what the actual twist would entail. However, once it did come out, I am kind of glad that we didn't actually see it play out, where it turns out that they would have had this challenge where the loser of that challenge would be automatically eliminated there. And that would have been absolutely terrible. It would have sucked to see someone's game come to an end here over this. And granted, it did seem like Paloma was the most likely person to be eliminated through this twist. She didn't seem to have that much comp ability. And obviously, with the fact that she walked, it didn't really change too much at the end of the day. But still, the fact that they thought that this was a good idea is just really bad, in my personal opinion. Then we get to the Fessy Bessie twist, which somehow managed to be even worse, in my opinion. And I actually remember listening to one of Taryn's live feed updates on RJP, and I remember at the time that he was making this huge rant against the Fessy Bessie twist, saying how this kind of indicates how it's possible that production is just trying to make the show as easy to edit as possible. for the obvious reason that this twist serves to benefit a majority alliance. And at the time, that was the Pose Pack Alliance, which really benefited from this twist by having like one person outside of the Pose Pack group in each of the pairings, so that no matter who was on the block, whoever was in the Pose Pack grouping on the block would end up staying here. So obviously this twist is really set up to allow for a steamroll here and didn't really give much room for a minority to form here. Now granted, we did see a flip happen during week 3 in which the Pose Pack was overthrown by the leftovers. However, even that there, we saw in weeks 4 and 5 how, like, again, the outsiders of the leftovers were simply taken out as a result there, with the sole source of intrigue being like the potential Brittany and Michael being on the block, the one group in which 2 leftovers were on the block. So at the end of the day, it still has the fundamental flaw of allowing a majority alliance to steamroll here, which, of course, considering the recent track record of majority alliances on Big Brother US, was a very real concern for a lot of people here. And admittedly, I feel like with the success of week 3, as great of a week as that was, seeing Pose Pack being dethroned here, I do worry that it'll lead to production thinking that this twist was actually a good thing and that it caused a flip here, when in reality, it's just a really bad twist, and production simply got very lucky that it ended up working out for them. And then the other major twist from the season was the split house twist that happened during the final 10. And I actually kind of like this twist, as it kind of reminds me a lot of the split tribals that we see on Survivor, where we literally divide the remaining players into groups, and each group has their own round here. And I do feel like this is the one major twist that I feel like could work on future seasons, and one that could lead to potential gameplay here. But with that said, I did find the actual rollout of the twist be mostly boring. Now, there was some intrigue on the outside group, particularly with Joseph and Turner for a lot of the week, where there was a possibility of Joseph staying in the game here. But by the end of the week, we do see Kyle flip the game on Joseph, winning that battle between them and making it so that that outside group was about to go back in and take on the people from the inside group. But obviously, other things that happened afterwards kind of got in the way with that. But still, it was at least somewhat interesting to see that. But then on the flip side, you got the inside group, which was completely boring, with the only source of intrigue being Jasmine winning the veto somehow. And through that, Monty would have gone home there. But obviously, once Jasmine did not win the veto, it led to a pretty boring week as well. So on the whole, I did find the implementation to be mostly mixed, but I actually do like the concept of a split house. And I wouldn't be opposed to seeing something like this used again in a future season. So at least there's that. But on the whole, I did find a lot of these twists that they implement on the season be pretty bad for the most part. And the ones that did work out, like the backstage twist as well as the Festy Bestie twist, kind of worked out in spite of whatever was their production intended here. And I do hope that they come away learning the right lessons here about what to use in the future seasons. Now, will they? Probably not, but hey, that's just my personal opinion. And finally, I did want to talk a bit about the gameplay here, which I do think is this season's biggest strength. Where obviously we saw on BB22 and 23, the gameplay being mostly stagnant with a majority alliance steamrolling most of the way through, leading to some pretty boring outcomes for the most part. But this season, however, was a bit more dynamic, and I felt like there really wasn't much of a slow week for a lot of it, where I felt like every week there was at least something interesting going on that contributed to the season, like, holding my attention. Obviously, in week 1, we saw like Paloma doing all the stuff that she was doing, creating all these alliances, and then creating what could have been a alliance that steamrolled, namely being Pose Pack. And then obviously we had all the stuff with Taylor ending up on the block and her potentially going home only for the twist and Paloma walking, getting in the way of that. So at least there's that. Week 2, we did see Pooch volunteer himself for the block and being sent out that way. That was a really fun storyline that week. Week 3, as I alluded earlier, was a pretty massive week on the show where we saw the leftovers come together, and just seeing all these people coming together with Kyle, like getting the information from Alyssa about old school, and through that getting all these people on board. And despite it seeming like it could have been a boring week with Turner as HOH, we do see Turner eventually capitulate to all these other people in creating this new alliance and flipping the game against Amira, who definitely came into the week as one of the safer people and one of the people that was running the game at that point. So obviously that ended up being a pretty strong week. Week 4 was a bit slower, but we did see Daniel use the veto in order to backdoor his own ally in Nicole, thinking that Taylor would go home against Nicole. But obviously, that just completely blows up in both of their faces. So, obviously, seeing that downfall was pretty good. Week 5 was a bit boring, in my personal opinion, despite the fact that Daniel claims, as he's being evicted, that the season just got boring, which was at least a little funny. But again, I guess that's just a consequence of the Fezzy Bessie twist. Week 6, we obviously got Taylor's HOH, which admittedly was pretty messy for the most part. And then we obviously saw as well Taylor like listening to Joseph's plan to backdoor himself and Joseph being a double agent. So at least there was that. Then we got to the split house twist, which again, the inside side of things was pretty boring, but the outside, just seeing Kyle like tell Terrence about the leftovers and turning the game on Joseph and making it seem like we were going into a split house at the final 8. Again, a lot of intrigue there. Final 8, we do see the downfall of Kyle, which again was a bit uncomfortable at points, but it was still a pretty interesting downfall for Kyle for the most part. File 7, we did see Brittany try to flip the game, again trying to protect Michael, who did seem to be a pretty consensus target if he didn't win a competition moving forward, so at least there was that. We obviously got the Michael eviction of the double final 6, which was very interesting. Just seeing Michael just scramble and trying to convince people to like save him, and obviously throwing Brittany under the bus, trying to guilt Turner into not voting out a gay man when he is bi. Again, take it or leave it, but it was still interesting seeing Michael scramble and really fight for his life there. Final 5, again, we did see Brittany try to maneuver things there and try to trick Turner into voting out Taylor, so at least there was that. Then we get to the Final 4, which was pretty boring in my personal opinion, especially once Monty won the veto. So that was a slow week. But then Final 3, we did see Monty ultimately win Final HOH, betray his best friend basically in voting out Turner, and then taking Taylor, and then just him getting demolished in a jury vote. So on the whole, it was a pretty crazy season where I felt like in most of the weeks, there was at least something interesting going on here. And considering how boring a lot of recent US seasons have been, it was pretty refreshing seeing just how consistent this season was from a gameplay perspective. And I guess on that note, we can talk about the winner in Taylor, who did not play the best game, in my personal opinion. I feel like she is probably in the bottom tier of winners here, where obviously there are a number of major knocks to her game, starting from week 1, where she was on the outs early on and probably would have been the first boot if Paloma hadn't walked and there wasn't the backstage twist. So obviously that's a pretty big knock there. And then moving forward, we get to the leftover creation, where she was the last person to be added to the leftovers, despite her being the one that benefited the most from that creation. So there's that. And I feel like moving forward, she was definitely in an all right position within the leftovers, but I feel like she was never exactly in the driver's seat, although she was able to build some core bonds there, particularly with the Michael and Brittany side of things. We obviously get to her HOH in week 6, which I did find pretty messy for the most part, where she did listen a bit too much to Joseph. She allowed Joseph to control too much of her HOH, and she was receptive to ideas like backdooring Joseph, which would have been a terrible move for her game. But then only after the veto, they saw the results there, and through that, Joseph was able to talk her out of that. But then she tried targeting Alyssa, but considering the fact that Kyle was the one to win the veto, that would have been a hard sell there. So I did find that aspect to be pretty messy. And then from that point on, I felt like she, again, wasn't in the driver's seat for a lot of it. We obviously get to the final 5, where again, there was a chance that Brittany could have flipped the vote against her, so that's not ideal. And then, of course, we get to the end, where I do have to give her some credit in that Monty was willing to take her to the end, despite the fact that he had a final 2 from Turner from much earlier in the game, and a final 2 that realistically Monty would have won. Now, granted, some of that was because Turner was perceived as being a much bigger jury threat than what he actually was, but still, I do have to give Taylor quite a bit of credit for getting close enough to Monty to where he does ultimately take her to the end. So I do find it to be a mostly up and down game where Taylor, again, wasn't in too much control for a lot of it. And through that, I can't have her super high on a winner ranking. But with that said, I do feel like there are enough merits to her game to where I would definitely have her above certain winners. Like, she's obviously better than Evil Dick. She's better than Rachel from BB13. Like, she's not the worst winner in the world, but there are still plenty of holes in her game that do make me not see her as a great winner per se. But there are enough merits to where I am somewhat satisfied with her win, both from a story perspective, but also from a gameplay perspective. So, on the whole, I do find the gameplay to be the strongest element to this season of Big Brother. And considering, again, the recent track record of US Big Brother, I do find that to be pretty good for this season, really one that allows it to stand out in a positive way. And through that, elevates my opinion of the season as a whole. So overall, I did find myself enjoying the season quite a bit. Now, granted, it's not a great season of the show. I mean, I still find the cast to be somewhat underwhelming, and I do find a lot of the twists introduced here to be pretty frustrating on the whole, even if they kind of worked out despite themselves for a lot of it. But it's really the gameplay of the season that really elevates it, and through that, I did find myself pretty engaged for a lot of it. And I feel like looking back, this will be a somewhat interesting season to consider, especially in the context of BB23, where we saw the cookout come into existence, really dominate the game in order to create a situation that allowed Xavier to win, become the first Black winner of the show. And then to go from there to BB24, where again, we do see the follow up to that, where we see players, for the most part, playing a more individual game, like not really as burdened by the notion of having to have the first Black winner, but then having that ideal still creep in, which was definitely a concern coming into the season where the Black players could have been targeted under the suspicion of there being a cookout. But to see like someone like a Kyle being the only one that really assumed that, only for him to have this big downfall, was very interesting in my personal opinion. And through that, we saw a mostly dynamic game play out. And then to see Taylor win the season after being such a big target early on and being an underdog leaves me pretty satisfied with the season on the whole. So, on the whole, I was pretty happy with this season, especially in light of recent seasons of BBUS that do make me feel pretty good about it. So there we go. That will do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe. It really helps out with the channel. Now, next week, I'll be doing my player ranking for BB24, so stay tuned for that. Survivor 43 is now in full swing, so I'll be updating my weekly power rankings for that, so stay tuned for that. The Amazing Race 34 is also happening on the same night as Survivor 43, so obviously I'll be doing power rankings for that. And if you haven't already, be sure to join my Discord server. I'll leave a link to join in the description. A lot of stuff coming your way. But for now, that's the video. See ya.